slides are not cooperating. There we go. The subtitle of this talk is all of the ways that you can now avoid using mod rewrite. So this is hopefully, you know, I will mention mod rewrite later on because there are some things about mod rewrite that are now easier than they were before. But if you want to know anything about mod rewrite, buy my book. There's my shameless plug. A little bit about me. I've been around the Apache Software Foundation for about 15 years, and I am the docs guy. So if you have deep questions about implementation details, there's several people in the room who I will defer to when you ask those questions. There's several things I'm going to talk about that Jim mentioned briefly, and I will give you a deeper dive into how those things work. Configuration variables, the if syntax, which Jim did not mention. A little bit more about the expression parser, some examples of mod macro, and several other things along the way. So in the ancient past, the way to make your Apache server configurable, if you wanted to have things that were dynamic, you were kind of out of luck in many ways. The things that you had available to you were repeated configuration blocks. You'd find yourself, if you were in a massive virtual hosting environment, you would find yourself cutting and pasting large chunks of configuration. That was very frustrating and error prone. Another thing that I have done repeatedly is put everything off in an include file and then include that multiple times, which works better, but still a little bit irritating at times. There were some few people coming in a little bit late. I always do this. I always start right on time and wish I hadn't. There were some third-party modules like mod macro that were available from the very early days, but because they were third-party macros, because they were third-party modules, and they weren't included with your favorite distribution, there was always a little bit of hassle in getting that integrated into your server. And for those of us that spent a lot of time on the IRC channel or on the user support mailing list, we would see this question 2 and 3 and 4 times a day. Can I use some sort of variable in my configuration file? Can I insert a variable that I define once and then use multiple times? And the answer was, of course, no pony for you. You need to just kind of suck it up and deal with the fact that this is how the configuration syntax works. With Apache 2.4, there are now many new ponies. And this image is actually from a presentation that I gave back at ApacheCon Stuttgart, where I highlighted all the things that I hated about the Apache web server. And this was the one time that my website was slash-dotted, so very proud of that. All right, so there are a wide selection of new ponies that are available in Apache 2.4, and we're going to talk about some of those. The first pony is configuration variables, and Jim mentioned this briefly. I'm going to show you a little bit more about how you might actually use this in your configuration. So the first one of these is one that's been around for a long time, but people seem to be fairly unaware of it. So I'm going to start with this. And this is the if-defined syntax. Now, in the old Apache 1.3 days, the documentation said that if you wanted to start with SSL enabled, you would do HTTPD -D SSL at the command line when you started it up. And what that was actually triggering was this block of configuration that was in ssl.conf that would turn on listening on port 443 and several other things. There were several things that are involved in an SSL configuration, obviously. And this syntax has been around, I believe, since the 1.2 days. So that's not new. But in 2.4, this has been enhanced a little bit. Oh, and by the way, you can do stuff like this. If you want to use the if-defined syntax, you can define your own variables. It's not that the SSL variable is somehow magic. You can use any configuration variable and set that when you start up your service. and turn on or off different parts of your configuration file using the -D flag at startup. So I clearly should have waited a few more minutes because I've got several more people that have come in since I started. I will give you all a reference to where the slides are when the presentation is done. Seems a repeated slide there. So in 2.4, there is this new syntax, this new configuration directive called define. And that allows me to set a configuration variable within my configuration file and then use that multiple places further on. So now if you download the source code to 2.4 and you look in the default configuration file that comes with it, you'll see this configuration syntax being used. A very frequent error in HTTPD configuration is to change the document root and then forget to change the directory block that goes along with the document root. And so you get a access denied error when you look at your website because you haven't actually granted access to that directory. Using this syntax, I simply change my document root one place, and that change, as it were, trickles all through the rest of my configuration. These variables are global to your entire configuration, and so if you're particularly picky about this kind of thing, you may wish to undefine a variable after you've created it so that it doesn't corrupt other things. This might be useful if you have a configuration where you're including lots of other configuration files that are managed by other people that are also using this syntax. So you may wish to define a variable and then not stomp on somebody else's use of a similarly named variable. All right, so continuing with the no pony for you theme, we have a new pony, and this is the if syntax. This is another thing that has been requested forever. Since I've been involved in HTTPD support, people requested this syntax, and now we finally have it. It is fully magical, and it allows you to evaluate an arbitrary expression within your configuration file at request time. And so you can look at whatever variables are in the environment, whether they are request specific or simply something like the time of day. Any environment variable that has been set by a handler or by your configuration itself. And this is a great alternative to mod rewrite in many cases. Now, some of the examples that I'll show you, the configuration is not any shorter, and sometimes it's even a little bit longer. But it is much easier to read, it's much easier to understand in my experience. But taking a small step back, I keep referring to arbitrary expressions, and one of the great new things in Apache 2.4 is the expression engine. And this is available to many modules use this, many configuration directives use this expression syntax. So I want to show you some of the expressions that you can use for that. So the expression parser is, as I say, new in the 2.4 branch. And here's some examples of expressions. So you can look at any arbitrary environment variable or request variable and do various comparisons on it, such as equal to or greater than and less than. The second example there, query string, and it is equals with a tilde, which applies a regular expression to a string. And so I can look in this case for a particular pattern within a query string, and if that matches, then do something based on that. There's a variety of comparisons that I can use. I can do string evaluations, numerical evaluations, regular expression evaluations, all the kinds of things that you might want to think of doing at request time. There's also a variety of special things that you can do that are specific to the network environment, like an IP address match. If you've ever if you've ever looked at regular expression matching for IP addresses, you know that it is notoriously difficult to match a particular IP address. This gives you the ability to match based on any IP address syntax that you like, whether it's a subnet definition or a 1.2 dot, and it will match anything within that subnet. Question? The question is whether this does IPv6, and it does. It will match IPv6 addresses as well. And then we've got string match and a special syntax here for using wildcards within your string match. Another cool thing that you can do with the expression engine is in. And in allows you to provide a list of values that you want to compare against. So in this particular example, I'm saying require. I'm using the require syntax, which is now way more flexible than it ever was before. And the expression that I'm passing to it is it Sunday or Tuesday or Thursday? And if so, I'm going to grant access to this portion of the website. Otherwise, I'm going to return a denied response. There's also a variety of unary operators where I can test various conditions with a single argument. Unary means a single argument. -D is something that looks for the existence of a file. -E looks for executable. -F, -S, these are standard things that you may have used in other syntaxes in the Unix world. Perl, Python, so forth have the same syntax, and this is borrowed from them for familiarity. Several more of those to test whether something's a symlink, to test whether something is a valid URL. This one's pretty cool. It has a performance impact, but when you use the -U, it will actually look to see whether the requested URL is eventually going to resolve to something. And so this checks things like aliases and redirects and a variety of other mappings that you might have defined in your configuration. So as you can imagine, because that does a sub request, that can be slow, but it's very useful in some situations. The question is, what happens if that's a proxy URL? I don't know, Jim. What would happen there? It does not run the handler, so it would probably fail at that point.
I think it would always work.
Oh, okay.
You did maps, you got through, there was no access control problem.
Got it.
That's my 50-50.
All right. That's our guess. That's our best guess. So these are unary operators that you can apply to strings. You can test if a string is not empty. You can test if a string is empty. This one's pretty cool. You can look at the remote address and do an IP match on it. So all of that to say, we can use this in any one of those syntaxes. We can use in an if block in your configuration file. There are some things that used to be really difficult but possible, and there were a wide range of things that were simply not possible without calling some third-party module or going out to perhaps a rewrite map. This allows you to do these things now pretty simply. So here's my first example of this. This is an example of where you're trying to enforce a canonical host name on a particular site. So we say, if the requested host is example.com, then redirect to www.example.com. As with many examples, this is a bad example. There's a better way to do this by simply putting a redirect in a virtual host, so you don't actually have to do a runtime configuration check. But nevertheless, it's a nice, simple example. In the past, you might have done something like this, where you would check a rewrite condition and then redirect to a particular, oh, I'm sorry. I had a slide missing there. Anyway. Okay, so in this example, what I'm doing is I'm showing you the old way of doing something called preventing hotlinking. So this is a case where you have people that are, some other website is linking to images on your website. They're embedding those images in their website. And so what you might try to do is look at the referrer, and if that referrer does not match your website, then you, what did I do here? I just did a redirect. So I redirect to an image that says, please don't link to stuff on my site. And that way, images embedded in your site work, and images that are embedded in another site will get this friendly message saying, please don't do this anymore. Yep.
Can you expand the acronym in that file name for the recording posterity?
Yeah, so the acronym was DIAF, which is, of course, Die in a Fire, as shown on this t-shirt here. This is how you might do this with the new if syntax. I can say if the referrer is not equal to my server name, then redirect any images to this other placeholder image which says, please don't do this. The big difference here, in addition to a more readable, I think, a more readable syntax, is that I've got the server name in here as a server variable, which means I can define this once and have it apply to all of my virtual hosts. Whereas in my previous example, I did not, in 2.2 and earlier, I did not have the ability to use a server variable within the rewrite condition syntax. So that's pretty cool. I win twice with this. Let's see, here's another example of something that I might simplify. This is a rewrite condition block that serves a different version of my website depending on whether I'm during business hours or outside of business hours. So I have two rewrite conditions, and the first rewrite condition says, is it after 7 in the morning? And the second one says, is it before 7 in the evening? And if both of those rewrite conditions pass, then this rewrite rule will be applied, and I will get the day version of my website. If either of the rewrite conditions fails, this rewrite rule will be skipped, and we'll go to the second rewrite rule, which will show me the evening version of my website. Or I can use the if syntax, combine those into a single expression. So if the hour is greater than, oh, I changed my time, huh? I'm getting up later with this version too, so that's even better. So once again, I win twice. Got 2 extra hours of sleep out of this syntax, that's perfect. So I'm going to redirect hours to open, and else I'm going to redirect it to closed. This isn't fewer lines of configuration. It's actually a few more lines of configuration. But it is much more readable, I think, and so better. The if syntax is evaluated at request time. So there is a performance hit in doing this. But you are going to be doing it another way with mod rewrite or something. So you're probably breaking even on that. But I like to consider maintainability as a pretty important thing as well. So that's cool. And typically, your performance is elsewhere anyway. Your performance loss, you need to optimize something else. So what else? Expressions can be used in a variety of other places. And this is the moment in my presentation where I panic and realize that I put in a placeholder slide and did not flesh it out any. But expressions can be used in authentication directives. So I showed you an example earlier of the require directive. You can say require expression and then provide any arbitrary expression there, which will then be used for authorization. Mod include is the server-side includes, oh. You know, I think I did put those slides in. I'm trying to remember back to last week when I was writing this. I'll come back to this if I missed some stuff. So I do have some examples of authorization. Yay me. Continuing the pony motif. So authorization, it's important to remember authorization and authentication are not the same thing. You all know that. So here's an example of four different examples of require syntax that you can now use, 3 of which use the expression syntax. So I've got the time of day thing there that I mentioned earlier. An important note here, which I actually opened a ticket about this, and I haven't checked up on the status about it. I found this out because of a documentation bug, actually. But you'll notice that the expression is not in quotes. In some configuration directives, the expression is in quotes, and in some it's not. And so you want to check the documentation to make sure you're doing the right thing until such time as that gets resolved somewhere. And I haven't followed up on that ticket, so I don't know if anybody's looking at that or if anyone else considers it a problem. I do. So in this second one, I've got a require expression that will block particular user agents from my website. It's useful to note, of course, that that's a completely useless way to do authorization because the user agent field on a client is pretty much totally in the control of the client. So that can be bypassed. But anyway, works as an example. If you're using mod SSL, it defines a variable HTTPS, and that is defined to either on or off the string value. And so you can use that in a require expression as well. There's also a shortcut to that, which is require SSL, and that syntax is provided by mod SSL itself. In addition to the require syntax that's provided by mod authz, what's the name of the module? Mod authz core. Several other modules provide authorization syntax that you can use, and so this is something that can be expanded indefinitely. I mentioned this a moment ago. This is invalid syntax. This is correct syntax. The quotes on there actually do break this. So be careful there. Mod include is a module that used to be very popular. It's not used very much anymore. But there's still, I mean, even on the Apache web server website, we use this quite a bit. There are cases where it can be very useful. And it can now use the expression parser syntax within if directives that are embedded in your HTML page. So if you're not familiar with mod includes, it allows you to put directives inside HTML files that are evaluated when that page is served. So this is actually a snippet from an HTML file that's being served by your web server. And you can put if directives in here. And so this is an example of where you might be saying to someone visiting your website that you're inside the company firewall or you're outside it by evaluating this expression here. And once again, the -R allows you to do an IP address configuration there. If you're not familiar with mod include, this is where the documentation is for that. You would turn it on using an options directive that attaches the, okay, so that did not parse correctly there. Give me just a second. So you would turn that on by turning on the includes option and then adding the includes output filter to pages with a .shtml extension, for example, or you could apply it to all HTML files or however you want to handle that. Now, in addition to those modules, we've also got mod rewrite, which has some new, I've lost my presenter. Oh, shoot. I hate it when that happens. There we go. So mod rewrite also has some hooks into the expression parser. I do encourage you to avoid using mod rewrite whenever possible, but when you need it, you can use this additional syntax. I was going to use a picture of a dead horse, but when you look for pictures of dead horses online, it's kind of gross, as you might imagine. So anyway, I've lost my mouse now. If you're not familiar with mod rewrite, I am giving a presentation on it sometime later this week, and you can dive into more of the details of mod rewrite. The rewrite condition directive allows you to look into any server variable, any expression, and with the new expression parser syntax, I can now use the expression keyword with rewrite condition and look for any any arbitrary expression that I want to evaluate. So in this case, I'm looking at the referrer and seeing if it matches the HTTP host variable. This is another way to do the example I gave earlier of preventing hotlinking. And in this case, I'm simply failing the request, returning a 403 forbidden response to that request. Mod macro has been around for a very long time. It is a third-party module by Fabian Coelho, and if you're using 2.2 and earlier, I still encourage you to use mod macro. It is a wonderful module. It's a huge time saver if you're doing anything in your configuration file that is more than hosting a single website. So if you're using 2.2 and earlier, you can go to Fabian's people.apache.org website and enable that using APXS. But with 2.4, we now have this module as part of the distribution of the Apache web server itself. So it just comes along for the ride. If you're installing a third-party package, like on Fedora 20, where 2.4 is now around, it'll just be there in your configuration file magically. It's wonderful. And you enable it with a load module directive. So as the name implies, mod macro allows you to create macros in your configuration file and then invoke them with arguments, an arbitrary number of arguments. And that will be done at server startup time. So at startup time, that macro is expanded, and then the expanded version is then passed to the configuration parsing phase. Here's the sort of canonical example of using mod macros. Probably the most common place that it's used is dynamic configuration of virtual hosts. So I'm going to create a macro, and I'm going to give it two arguments, name and domain. And then I plug those into the relevant places in the configuration. I have a server name based on the domain. I have a server alias prepending the www. Maybe I want that in there. And then I define my document root, my error log, and my access log using the short name of the server. And in this way, I can now create multiple virtual hosts with a single line each. And Jim showed that example earlier in his presentation. So that's pretty cool. That's a great time saver. One of the caveats here is to reemphasize this is done at server startup time. So if you want to add a new virtual host using this syntax, you would have to restart the server in order to reparse that configuration file. There is an undef macro directive as well. Again, if you're in a situation where you've got lots of people managing different included files, you may not want to stomp on somebody else's namespace because macro names are global. So you define your macro and you invoke it and then you undefine it so you don't step on somebody else's use of the same name. Here's an example, a second example using authorization. I want to define various directories and the authorization group that goes along with them. And so I can define just once with my macro and then invoke it multiple times with different directories and access groups. Now, if you have multiple virtual hosts and each one has a local difference of some kind, you can use this method, which is kind of cool. You can define two macros, one for your basic virtual host stuff, and then one to close off that block. And you would use the begin virtual host block, which is this piece here, which defines it, and then the end virtual host block, which closes off the virtual host tag. And in the middle, you would put the things that are specific to that particular virtual host that may be different from other virtual hosts. So I may, turn on the Zen framework for a particular virtual host and not for another one. Yes?
Another way that I was thinking you might do that would be including some additional configurations with an include statement inside the macro.
Yes.
And my question is, if that was possible, are the macro variables that are declared at the top of the macro definition, do they propagate down into, are they global within the macro?
They are, yeah. So the question is whether if I use an include directive here instead of putting the configuration here, do the variables defined in the macro go into the include file? And they do, because that's all parsed and built at server startup time, and those variables are applied to the included file. I will mention there is another configuration module called mod vhost alias, and I am not particularly fond of it, but there are cases where it can be useful. In specifically the context of virtual host, it does the same thing that mod macro does, but it's much more limiting. So I can use this thing called virtual document root, and it defines a document root that gets mapped to a particular host name. Unfortunately, mod vhost alias does not allow me to define a log file per virtual host or anything else specific to each virtual host. But the syntax here is kind of interesting. I've got this syntax here where I've got %1, %2, and %3, which refer to the different sections of the host name. So this is %1, and this is %2, and this is %3. I can also pull off individual letters from those different segments of the host name. And so %2.1 becomes A, 2.2 is P because it's pulling off particular letters from the second portion of the host name. So the advantage, the one advantage that mod vhost alias has over some other approaches is that the moment that you make a DNS pointer pointing a host name to your server, mod vhost alias knows what to do with it. You don't have to restart the server in order for that to pick up because it's just parsing the host name as it comes in. Mod Proxy Express, Jim mentioned this module. This is pretty cool. This allows you to map a host name straight through to some back-end server that you've got, protected behind there. So this would be the old way of doing this. You would, for each host name, you would define a virtual host block and proxy pass through to it. The proxy pass reverse directive, if you're not familiar with that, takes care of rewriting headers that come back from the back-end server. So for example, if back.end.server returned a redirect header with its own name in it, the proxy pass reverse would strip out that host name and put in the host name of the front-end server so that the client is not confused. And every time you use a proxy pass directive, you need to use a proxy pass reverse directive as well. Now, if I have 1,000,000 of these, or if I have 100 of these, I can, instead of putting in all those virtual host blocks, I can create an express map file with host name and what it maps to on the back end. Jim mentioned earlier, for those of you who were not here, that in future versions of this module, you'll also be able to put in some of the proxy pass options on the tail end of that. So I create this text file. I use the httext to dbm utility to convert that into a dbm file. And then in my configuration, I point to that map file that I've created, and it does does the proxy pass dynamically. Another advantage of this is that when you update that map file, the mod proxy express notices that the timestamp on that file has been updated, and it reloads that so that you don't have to restart the server in order to add a new configuration. I've run two slides together here. Balancer Manager Jim mentioned, and that's a pretty cool way to manage your proxy balancer. And so you could think of that as a configurable configuration thing as well. That's not new in the 2.4 version. That's been around since 2.0, but it continues to be enhanced as we go forward. And Daniel will be giving a talk on that at 3, well, on proxy stuff in general at 3. So there's a lot of other things that you can do to make your configuration dynamic, and I thought that I would be running out of time here, but there are modules that Jim mentioned, like mod sed and mod proxy HTML, that can do some of the dynamic rewriting on the content that's actually being streamed to you. So mod sed would allow you to apply sed-like syntax to the actual HTML that's being served. So this might be useful if you've got a closed source third-party product that you're running on your website. You're proxying through to that from your Apache server front end, and you might want to rewrite some of the things that are being served in that HTML that you don't have direct access to in the code. Mod proxy HTML is another really cool module. It's by Nick Q, and he donated that to the foundation, I don't know, a couple of years ago, 2-3 years ago. And mod proxy HTML is for situations where you're proxying a back-end server and there's a lot of stuff that is hard-coded in there, like maybe host names and cookies, things in response headers, things in the HTML itself. And mod proxy HTML is intelligent enough to look for things and rewrite them based on the front end, the disparity between the front-end server name and the back-end server name. Things in JavaScript, for example. So that's pretty cool. So are there any questions about any of this stuff? Oh, come on. Yes? People love it. People on the IRC channels and the user email list, the responses tend to be, why didn't you do this 10 years ago? And it's seen as a compelling reason to move to 2.4. When 2.0 came out, there was no big compelling reason to move to it, and so adoption was incredibly slow. 2.2 had some new stuff, but and the transition from 2.0 to 2.2 was fairly easy. And so we saw a quick transition there, but people seem anxious to move to 2.4. And so I attribute that to a lot of these things. Yes?
Any thoughts about changing the default configuration file to include the statement? Like also people can actually see it.
Yeah, so Daniel's question is regarding changing the default configuration file to include this stuff. And we've done that a little bit. We're using some define directives in the default configuration file. One of the things that you see, however, is that those configuration files don't trickle downstream very quickly. So you would see that in the HTTPD source code, but if you install the Fedora package or the Ubuntu package, you won't see that yet. And so, I guess the thing to do there is to work with those package managers to make that happen faster. But yeah, I do want to do that. So those examples are in there.
Do you know what the pushback from Ubuntu or Fedora from the packages is?
No, I don't think there's any pushback. I think they're just not aware of it. And so, in particular, Ubuntu and Debian have a configuration layer on top of their default configuration file. So they have more to do to bring it up to that, I think. I don't know. Fedora folks I really haven't talked to, so I don't know what the process would be to get that in there. I don't remember who does that package these days. Still Mark Cox? I'm not sure. Probably not. Anyway, any other questions? All right. Well, thank you all for attending this talk, and there's a lot more HTTP content coming. So thank you very much.